I'm Emilie Lunt, and I believe with my whole heart and soul that our homes are places where we can seek and love the truth, celebrate beauty, and learn good things every single day. That's why I'm educating my kids at home, and I know you can do it too. Welcome to Heart and Soul Homeschool. Well, I'm really looking forward to chatting with my guest today. She's a homeschooling mom of four, a writer, a photographer, and you're going to find out so much more than that. Rachael Alsbury, thanks for being here with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciate you driving up, so you're kind of local to us here, and so you have an adventure coming up that we're going to talk about in just a minute, so I'm glad I caught you before you start this adventure. But before we dive into that, do you want to tell us just a little bit about you and your family and what you do?
Yeah, so we have 4 kids. The oldest is turning 13 and the youngest is 5. And we've been homeschooling for about 8 years. So when my oldest one was about to start kindergarten, they passed some legislation in the state where we were living, which was California. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really feel comfortable sending her to school. But I also, homeschool was not on my radar. So I was in a little bit of a crisis. And my husband, who was homeschooled, was like, why don't you homeschool? Let's do that. And so I got thrown into it very unwillingly. And it turns out I was always a homeschooler. I just didn't know it. And it's been a really wonderful part of motherhood for me. And it's been a great thing for our family.
So you've created quite an online community. And so how did that come apart of your homeschooling?
Well, I started a blog when my oldest daughter was 1. My husband was like, you should write, you should start a blog. And so I was just writing about whatever interested me. And as soon as I mentioned we're in a homeschooling crisis and I don't know what to do, people were like, tell us about that. And so I started writing about just kind of our struggle and our process and where we went with that. And then I started developing my own processes. And people were like, well, tell us, what do you do? And so I started to share that on my blog. And so I've created courses and I do podcasts and different things like that, where I just share a little bit about how to find clarity in your homeschool and how to develop systems and processes that actually work for your family. Because a lot of times I do find that people get and I was like this, very focused in on the content and metrics and where we're supposed to be, and they get paralyzed in taking action. And so that is one thing I like to help people with.
Yeah, I think that's great because so many of us need help with that, whether we're just starting out. Sometimes you need tune-ups along the way. And so I think you're very capable of helping all of us in that. And I want to talk more about that, but let's kind of back up. So you said that you never imagined yourself as a homeschooler. And I think a lot of us, if we're being honest, we're probably in that boat. I don't meet many people who always knew that they wanted to homeschool. And do you think that that will change in the coming years as homeschooling becomes more popular? Do you think it will become more of a natural progression where people plan to do it, maybe rather than those of us who are doing it out of necessity or due to circumstances where we just know we need to?
Definitely, because I think in the past you saw homeschooling as almost like a more protective action that parents would take. And now that information is more readily available and it's something that's you don't have to go to a school to get, you don't have to have a certain curriculum to get, we have it all on the internet. People are going, wow, that's actually an opportunity for my family. And we can actually broaden what we're doing. And it's not so much of a reaction as it is something that people are doing proactively now. So I think with the way that information is so available, I think it's going to become more popular because people are going to see that as an opportunity rather than something that they have to do. I still think there will be that. Yeah. But I think it's going to open it up to more people that might not have thought about doing it before.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And even as we just think about that even more, I think there's a concept of running from something bad, which is maybe how it was more in the past, and then running to something good. And so while we might still want to protect our kids from certain things that might be going on in public schools or other educational settings, there is still just that excitement, I think, that people are catching on to more and more about the opportunities and the possibilities that homeschool provides. Yes. So I think it's an exciting time to be a part of it for sure. So as we think about where you are now, you and your husband have really different educational backgrounds. So do you want to talk about that? I didn't realize he was actually homeschooled himself.
Yes. So I had, my dad was a public school teacher. There were 7 of us. So I'm the oldest of 7. My dad was a public school teacher. And it was a big deal that, we all would be on the college track because that was really important to my parents. And so that is what I did. I did the traditional, we went to public school. I did a couple years of homeschool when I was little, but it was mostly public school. And then I did college and graduated college. My husband, his mom, so my mother-in-law, was what I consider like a pioneer of homeschooling in the 80s. She was like, we were afraid that someone was going to come knocking on our door.
Yeah,
so
isn't that crazy that
yeah.
as recent as our childhood? That was true.
Oh yeah, it was a different world. And so he was homeschooled, he was private school, he did public school. Then he convinced his mom that school was boring and could he skip 2 grades. So he skipped 2 grades of school.
Is that in high school?
This was in, I think, 1 in grade school and 1 in junior high. He skipped it. And then in high school, he did independent study. But because he was doing independent study, then he was able to do what he really loved to do, which was learning computer programming. And he was learning programming and learning how to use the internet in the early days when he was like 15 or 16 and actually started a business. So he was mostly doing his business. And that is what he does to this day to support our family. And so I would always tease him like, man, you had such a chaotic education. And really, what he had was a tailored education that was super individual to him. And I've just seen the fruit of that in our life and in our marriage and in our work life. So we have a lot of freedom. When he wants to learn something, he just goes and learns it. He takes home these big books from the store. And so he goes into companies and helps them problem solve. So they like to bring him in because he's an out-of-box thinker and he's a problem solver. And so seeing that play out has just encouraged me that we can give our kids a tailored education. It doesn't have to look like an education that's in the box for them to be really successful.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I think what you just described is probably every homeschool mom's dream of what our efforts will produce in some way. That critical thinking, that confidence in learning, the love of learning, and the knowledge of how to learn, which is something that I've realized more and more that I never learned how to learn. And so I was always at the top of my class in school and always kind of bored, and so I was doing all the things. But when I got to college, I really struggled because I never learned how to learn. And so it's encouraging to me as a mom kind of in the middle of it to hear a real life story of someone who kind of followed this progression that we're all in the middle of now and came out on the other side with the confidence to do what you just described your husband doing. And it's working great for him. So that's exciting to hear. So talk a little bit about, because this is what makes you really interesting, or just one of the things that makes you interesting. So you've homeschooled in several states, right? And that's kind of a unique experience. Not many of us will probably have the opportunity to do that. So do you want to just tell just a little bit about your family's movement and how you ended up?
So we had all our kids in California. That's where we moved after we got married because David, my husband, is a native of Northern California. And so we lived there, had all the kids, started homeschooling there. And it's definitely there's pros and cons to homeschooling in different regions, I think. So California has a lot of charter schools, so you can homeschool through charter schools there, and they fund those. And there's also like a big outdoor community there. So being outdoors was a big part of our homeschool when we lived there. Now in Missouri, there's much more of a very established Christian faith-based homeschooling community. So you guys, or we have all of these amazing amenities. So like the drop-off co-ops, that we have Midwest Parent Educators, which offers all these resources. We have organizations like this at Herzog. In California, it's not as, we don't have as much of the Christian established base. So our community was a little bit more organic. There was like a little bit more of, I guess you would say maybe a diversity of reasons for homeschooling. So people tended to homeschool more for lifestyle reasons than maybe faith-based reasons. So it's definitely like the groups that I was a part of there are different than the groups that I'm a part of here.
So more like a secular homeschooling outlook, and then maybe just people love the flexibility, or they love the freedom to travel and be outside, that kind of thing, more than a faith-based reason.
Right. And there are people that certainly homeschool for faith-based reasons, but there seems to be like a little bit more of a variety of reasons for doing it, which of course California, has a different type of legislation and regulations, and there's that to consider too. So
right. Yeah, it's interesting. So you actually moved across country here, and you've kind of been living the homeschool mama dream. It seems like everyone. Do you have chickens?
I do have
You
chickens.
actually have, she's one of those moms that has the chickens that everyone dreams of having. But tell us why you made that decision for your family.
Yeah, we were just really wanting to explore, like, what would it be like to live in a different region? What would it be like to live on maybe some land? And would that meet our goals as a family? My husband's really interested in owning land. And so we were like, let's just give this a shot. So we lived on the Kansas side for a little bit. Then we moved and bought 10 acres on the Missouri side. We got the chickens, which we love. We're going to have chickens in our backyard neighborhood in California because we love them so much. And so it was really like an experiment, which is something we were able to do because we homeschool and because my husband works for himself. So we were able to just be like, well, let's try this and see if it works. And so we were very homesick for California. So we decided we're going to head back there. But I love that my kids got the experience of living where I grew up and getting to be close to my family. And so that is actually part of our homeschool is they got to come out here and they lived on 10 acres and they raised baby chicks and had chickens and got to go to a really cool homeschool co-op. So
yeah, that's really neat that you were able to do that. And I think some people don't realize the opportunities like that. You know, you can spend more time with your family. You can pursue those interests, and not just for your kids, but also for us as parents. It kind of lightens that load of pressure on the whole family in a lot of ways. I mean, there are new pressures that come with homeschooling that you kind of swap out, but there is tremendous freedom that I think is really exciting if we let ourselves take advantage of it, which kind of brings me to the next thing that I want to talk to you about. Let's talk unschooling. So this is one of those terms that I think probably when people hear the term unschooling, I don't know, what do you think people think when they hear it?
It's a really off-putting term. Like, honestly,
it kind of stresses me out. I'm not going to lie when I think about it.
It's a radical term. I think the difference between a lot of people think, oh, unschooling means no education. It's actually, we are educating. We're just not using the systems and structures of school.
Yeah.
So you would use the child's interests, or you would use just real life circumstances to learn those academic subjects that you would if you were in a very structured school setting. And there are pros and cons to both. So a traditional education is structured, it's centered around teachers and ideas. There are proven outcomes from that. Whereas unschooling, or what you could maybe just call natural learning, doesn't maybe have the same, guarantee of outcomes, but you can give your child a very tailored education and see them excel in things that might be outside of the academic box.
Yeah. So when I've thought of homeschooling, until I found you a while ago, I was just picturing like feral children kind of roaming the neighborhood in little bands of homeschoolers, like looking at rocks and studying bugs just at will, and you just wonder how that turns out later in life. But I love the term that you use. You call yourself a guided homeschooler. And so you kind of just described that, but go into more detail about that, because as I've read what you write about your method of guided guided unschooling, we may all be a little bit unschooly and not even realize it. What do you think?
I think that's true. Unschooling to me, now the people that are purists about unschooling might disagree with me, but I think it's on a spectrum. You can be more structured. So for example, I tell my kids, hey, we live in the state of Missouri. We have subjects that we're required to do. So everyone has to do a little bit of math every day, but it's very self-paced. It's very child-focused. They work at their own pace. They get to pick their own curriculum. So there's more latitude in that structure. So we tend to fall on that more structured side. Now, there are families that are like, we just do nothing but live, and then they learn that stuff through living, or they learn it later when they need to pick up the information.
Just as their interests.
Yeah, or like they're like,
skill.
Suddenly I want to go to college. So they take a bunch of intensive courses to get them caught up, and they go to college. So there's different ways of doing it. So we kind of fall on a little bit more of the structured side.
So tell me more. That's intriguing to me that you let your kids choose their own math curriculum. So what does that look like? Because you have elementary aged kids. I'm just picturing if I let my daughter do that, what does that practically look like?
When I first start them out, I start with the same math curriculum. It's Math UC. I love that curriculum.
Yeah, that's a favorite of lots of people.
It hits the sweet spot for a lot of people. But like, if they're like, I'm bored, I don't want to do this, I'm like, hey, let's switch it up. Let's try a new math curriculum. So, I like, for example, my daughter, I got on YouTube with her and we just looked at all different videos of math curriculums, and she picked the one she wanted. She picked the most structured. She picked Saxon math.
Not interesting.
She loves it. So she does Saxon math, and I consider us unschoolers. So yeah, I would sit with them and collaborate with them over, what do you like about this? What do you like about that? And then we put together a plan together. So it's more of a child-centered plan.
And that in and of itself, as I'm hearing you talk about that, is building such good life skills, right? Because those are the decisions that we're making as adults. We're looking at our options and seeing what we like about this one, what we like about that one, and then ultimately deciding what's going to serve us best. So that practice that you're giving them is really valuable.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. And my control freak self probably tends to skip over that. But I think there's a lot of value. So I think every homeschool mom comes to a point where we realize that there are going to be gaps in our kids' education. And probably, even though we realize that, it can give us anxiety. But I think, I'm beginning to come to a certain peace about that. I can't teach them everything. I can't plan for every contingency in their life. And so do you think that people view unschooling, even if it's a little bit more structured, do you think that people think that there's a better chance of having like a gap that can't be overcome? Because that's, if there was anything that scared me, that would be it as a mom. And what if I missed something?
That's it. That's what most people will mention. Like, what about learning this or this or this? So I think you have to understand that there's trade-offs you make when you move from a traditional style of education, which is centered on commonalities, a really big value. So everybody learning the same thing at the same time. The idea that there is a body of information that we need to learn in order to be considered an educated person, that's just a value of traditional education. It's not necessarily that your kid is having a better education, it's a different education. So there is this, I think people really cling to the idea of this set body of knowledge that you have to know to be considered educated or successful. So what you're doing is you're trading that idea for the idea that I'm going to uncap my child. So maybe there will be gaps in their education, but they're going to have the tools to know how to go get that information when they need it. So through just utility. Or they may never need it and they just went off into an area where they just excelled. So like my husband, for example, he didn't learn how to write essays. He didn't learn how to write MLS formatted, reports or anything like that. But he got to learn how to program. That's what he does. That's what he excels at. And so he's just done that. So there are gaps, but you kind of know that you're making a little bit of a trade-off there.
Yeah. Well, and as you're talking about, those formats of papers and all of that stuff, that minutia a lot of times is what will kill our love of learning when we get bogged down, and that's what we think learning or education is, and we don't like that, and so then we don't pursue learning the things that we do love. And so I think one thing that you had written in your blog post, I think it was about your husband specifically, that you said that he never felt like he had to ask permission to learn anything, and I thought that was so beautiful. Do you find your kids taking on that same attitude and enthusiasm?
Yeah, and what I see with my kids is they're not intimidated to learn something. They don't look at learning and see it, oh, that's hard. So they're able to do more advanced things that are outside the academic box. So, like my daughter is learning how to use professional design programs. She's learning how to outline a novel and do all of these advanced things that you would think, oh, you have to wait till you're in high school or college to learn that. It's like, no, you don't have to wait. You can learn that. And then if we need to work on our grammar, because we do, then we'll just do that while we're outlining your novel, and we'll learn about periods and capitalization and where to put the commas. So you don't have to ask permission to go do that thing you actually really want to be doing. You don't have to wait for that.
Yeah, I think that's so neat. And that's inspiring even for me as a mom, because I can model that so much better for my kids by the things I choose to pursue and show them me learning and wanting to always be in that process. So you were very candid about how overwhelmed you were by homeschooling at the beginning. And I think we've all been there, right? And I think some of us move past it more quickly or find ways to kind of cope with that. And you have coped with that by putting systems into place in your life. So talk just a little bit about that, how you developed those and now how you share them with other moms.
Well, I have to give credit to the homeschoolers that went before me for this, because when we first started, I signed up with a charter school. I had done no prep. I had never even seen the inside of a homeschool math curriculum. I had no idea. They sent me a spreadsheet and were like, pick any curriculum you want. And I was like, what? So I said, just pick for me. So she picked a curriculum for me. They sent it to me. It was a binder about this thick, kindergarten curriculum. By the way, we didn't end up doing kindergarten because legally I realized we didn't have to start her till she was 6, so we didn't. But at the time, it was, this thick, and I thought we were doing the curriculum, and we had done two of the subjects. Like I was so confused. And so I was at a crisis. So I was calling my friend who was a homeschooler. Of course, she wasn't available because they were hiking in Yosemite, because that's what homeschoolers do in September when everyone else is gone. They're going to go hiking, you know? Right. So she's like, I'm going to send you a podcast. So she sent me a Wild and Free podcast. Okay. And the lady that was on there, it was Pam Barnhill. So she's wonderful. And I heard her talking about morning time and this concept of a morning basket, where the nucleus of their homeschool, like 80% of what their learning was taking well-written, high-quality literature and nonfiction books, putting them in a basket and reading out of them a little bit every day. And I was like, now that I can do. I went out, I went to the thrift store, got a basket, went and found a book list online, filled it up, and we started reading for hours a day. And that became the base of our homeschool. And so that was like an actionable plan that I could do that took my focus off of, are there going to be gaps? Or are we doing the right curriculum? Or where are we supposed to be when she's 6, 7, 8? And it was just like, it took all that off and put my focus on the lifestyle and the life learning as a lifestyle.
Yeah, and the togetherness.
Yes.
Because I kind of had the same experience with Pam, where it just blew my mind how simple it was. And it's like, why didn't I think of that? But I didn't. And she lays it out so beautifully. And it makes you feel like, wow, like that's what I want. That time together where we're all learning the same things. We're having discussions about the same things and things that are good and true and beautiful. And so I think that's a great starting point for a lot of moms. So from that, you've branched into these systems that you use to run your homeschool and really your whole life, because it's not separate, right? Homeschool isn't separate from life. It's all kind of like a bowl of spaghetti, right?
That's one thing I talk a lot about is, you know, the heart and soul of your homeschool, which I call your homeschool DNA. Your family circumstances are unique to you. No one else has those. And that's going to be reflected in your homeschool. That's why people say, well, it's different for every family. It is, because we're not doing school in a separate environment, like in a conventional classroom. We're doing it at home, where all the attributes of our lives are affecting that. If we have a baby, the ages and spacing of our kids, if our kids had a special diagnosis, whether our husband works from home or works 80 hours a week outside the home, all of that's going to affect how we homeschool and how we do it. So it does have to be unique to that family. So I try to create systems that any family could do. You know, you can plug that in and, you know, turn the dials up and down on that. So
yeah, I think that's great. And I actually kind of reviewed you have something, you call it the simple start, and you talk about these on-ramps.
Yeah.
So talk about that just a little bit.
One of the biggest and most confusing questions, and this is a question I had, is what is my first step to starting homeschool? The reason the question's confusing is because there are many ways to do it. And so it's more of like, there's these different on-ramps and there's these different aspects to homeschooling, and you can pick where you want to start. If you want to start with curriculum, you can start with curriculum. If you want to start with finding your homeschool style, which is actually where I recommend you start, if you can, finding your homeschool DNA, that will help you make a lot of the other decisions. You can do that. I actually started with the community piece because I had friends that were homeschooling that were convincing me to do it. And so I started building homeschool community before we really even got deep into the academic part of it.
So when you talk about, and you kind of said this, but this is one of the reasons why I think I love you so much, is you like what you call homeschool DNA, I would call the heart and soul of your homeschool. And so we talk about how what your heart and soul is, or your big why for homeschooling, is really going to determine the how. And so a lot of those things that feel overwhelming at the beginning, you don't know where to start. Once you've determined that why, they all kind of start to fall into place. And I'm assuming that's why you say start with the DNA, the foundational why you're doing it, because that helps you choose your curriculum. It helps you establish those rhythms, right?
Exactly. And you nailed it. Like if you know the why, you're going to know the how. The tough part about this is a lot of people don't even know what their options are. And there's a quote by a famous teacher. His name's John Taylor Gatto. And he says, there are as many ways to become an educated person as there are fingerprints. And so a lot of people don't actually know what the options are. What are the different styles and models of homeschooling? What are the 7 different homeschooling philosophies? So I lay that out in one of my courses so that people can go, oh, that resonates with me, because every model and style of education has values that underlie it. It's more of an art than it is a science. I guess education is considered an art and a science, but I think it's probably a little bit more of an art than a lot of people think. So if you can know what your values are, you can match that to the philosophy, you're going to have a way easier time knowing what it is you're supposed to do when you get up on that first day of homeschooling.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when you look at those philosophies, which in and of itself is super overwhelming to me because some of them have like volumes of books that were written in the 1800s, and while it's great information, it's like I don't have time for that. But I found myself kind of pulling little pieces from each of those because I realize, while I love Charlotte Mason and the overlying values of her system of education, that in totality doesn't fit our lifestyle. And so I pull little pieces from that and little pieces from other, sort of philosophies. And that makes our homeschool. And I think that's kind of what it seems like you've done, right? And so I think, but as moms, sometimes we get so excited about our particular method that you can feel like you have to choose one. You don't have to choose one. We're examples of that, right?
Right. I think most families probably have 1 to 3 what I call guiding philosophies. So you're probably gonna have 1 to 3 philosophies that really inform what you do. So mine is obviously my number one. My favorite is Unschooling. But then we started as Charlotte Mason, and so I love some of her really literature-based things. And then we do a lot of unit studies. And so we've done a lot of those in the past where we're integrating the learning into one topic. So those are our guiding philosophies. So we've used all of those through the years. And when you're doing it in a practical way, it's hard to stick to one in a very pure way, especially as you said, they're dated, they're older, they were matched with in a different time. So to bring that into our current lifestyle, we have to pick several, but we can do that. We have the freedom to do that.
Yeah, and I think when we give ourselves the freedom to not have to stick so tightly, because when I first started, I thought all homeschoolers, had nature notebooks, and they were doing, like, their kindergartners were doing these beautiful watercolor paintings of birds, that they would spot, and like that's really not the reality. And so when I realized that freed up a lot of pressure, and that's kind of a silly example, but I think we've all got those little things that we can get hung up on, that we're not doing it right. But really, there's so much, like you said, a spectrum of what's right for your family, which I love. So we will link back to all of your courses because I found them to be very helpful. I know that other moms who are listening will find that very helpful. We're almost out of time, but I'm going to do just kind of a little rapid fire question and answer, if you don't mind. So you talk a lot about a print-rich and limited screen environment. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's actually been research done that shows when you have a lot of print in your environment, so, posters, books primarily for most people, that your child is surrounded by words and print, that they will do better academically. And so we have really, especially in the early years, now we use screens now more for learning, but in the early years, we really tried to limit that and make books the entertainment, get them more in a mode of creating instead of like just consuming or giving them a game on an iPad or whatever, which there's a time and place for that for sure. But I just found that my kids would read more, they would create more when we limited the screens.
And allowing for boredom is a big reason why we do that at our house.
That is so hard for me. I'm like, my kids are like, I'm bored. And I'm like, immediately like, am I doing good enough? And it's like, no, this is so good because in an hour, they're going to do something really cool. But I have to give them like that hour of boredom to like go find a book they haven't read or like find an art supply they haven't used in a while.
Yeah, and it's good for us too to understand that it's okay for them to be bored because we're with them all the time, right? Which is beautiful, but that means that we have to be on all the time. And so I think for us too, that it gives me a lot of freedom to say, no, it's okay for them to not be entertained by me every second of the day. And you're right, that's when some of the really fun, like I found my little boy today, he loves to vacuum. He's 4 and he loves to vacuum. And he had taken our vacuums apart and was vacuuming the insides of the other vacuum with a vacuum, but only because he was bored, right?
That sounds like our sons would really get along.
Yeah, we need to get them together before you leave. No. Okay, so books. You mentioned a literature-rich education. I think that's something that every homeschool mom kind of envisions. We want to sit around and read the books together and the read-alouds. How do you choose them? Because when I started, a lot of the recommendations are classic books that while they have their place, they're not exactly easy to get through always. So how do you choose the literature that you use in your school?
That's a really good question because we started out as Charlotte Mason homeschoolers, and in that world, it's all about the classic old literature. And I would try to read some of that, and my kids were like, we don't relate to this at all. And there's also like they were written in a time period within a certain culture that's sometimes not really relevant or maybe not even appropriate, So I started that way until I found a curriculum that I love. It's called The Peaceful Press, and so many homeschool moms have made amazing literature-based curriculum that is like Homeschool Mom curated. So I get a lot of my literature from there. And it's a mix of classics and newer. I like the newer stuff because, like I said, it gives you like, you get different perspectives. So for example, we read Little House on the Prairie because that's a classic. Right. But that was from, Laura Ingalls' perspective at the time. So then we found a newer piece of literature that gave us the perspective of the Native Americans when they were going through that same time period. So I do love a mix, and I love homeschool mom created curriculums, and there's book lists all over the internet. So we're very ad hoc with that.
Yeah, we kind of are too. And I love you actually have a book, not a book, but a list of books, not for kids, but for homeschool moms, right? Which is fun too, because I think sometimes we neglect our own reading, but that's always fun to see what other moms are reading.
Yes.
So, okay, last one. What's the hidden gem of homeschooling that you've kind of uncovered as a reluctant homeschooler?
There are so many hidden gems. I think for me, I know that if we had not homeschooled, I would not be connecting with my kids on the level that I do now. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't know as much about them. We wouldn't have built as many memories as we have together. And I was able to share all these really special parts of their childhood. And that is something I never even thought of. I thought, well, I'll just send you to school. I never thought of what I would be missing if I did that. And so I think that is the greatest value for me and the greatest hidden gem of our homeschooling.
The time, right?
Yeah,
Just the time that you can't replace.
Yeah.
Yeah, all those sweet little moments that you don't plan, right? It's the ones that you don't plan. Usually when I try to plan something fancy, it never gets quite the reaction that I had hoped for. It's just the little things that kind of pop up
conversations
throughout
in the
day.
car and like, the conversations that you go into when you're reading a book and it's like, oh, it's an hour later and we were in this really good conversation about, morals and ethics and all these things you wouldn't get, if you weren't with me.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point also about the screens that you said. Like if we're not on screens in the car, if we're not on screens at home all the time, it allows for that conversation too. So It all kind of interconnects, doesn't it? Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being here. And like I said, we're going to link back to your courses and your blog and your Instagram and all of that because I'm always encouraged when I see what you put out there. So thank you for spending the time with us today. And for everyone else, I hope you'll join us next week for the next episode of Heart and Soul Homeschool.
Heart and Soul Homeschool is a podcast presentation of the Herzog Foundation. The views and opinions expressed on the show are those of the host and guests and not necessarily the views of the Herzog Foundation. Be sure to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode of Heart and Soul Homeschool.